Welcome inside the second floor of the Duncan Student Center. This is Shamrock Sports. Austin Rooney, Caroline Pineda, and David Korzanowski. We got a big matchup this weekend.
Ranked matchup for the first time in the 70s.
Yeah, and it seems like people kind of forget that because the stadium hasn't sold out.
Oof.
Ranked opponent. People.
We'll get all of that and more next on Shamrock Sports.
I don't know. She has the intro. Go.
All right, well, we are going to stay right here, folks. Let's jump right into last week's matchup now against the Duke Blue Devils. The Fighting Irish had a quite resounding victory. This is sort of what we predicted last weekend. Notre Dame would take home this win. They won 38-7. Does this answer some of Notre Dame's questions about their struggles coming into this season?
I'm going to say no, because the question for Notre Dame has not been can they beat unranked teams. It's can they win the big games. Because if you look at the past 4 or 5 seasons, look at 2015, they lost to Clemson and Stanford. 2016, kind of an outlier. There was a lot of things that went wrong in that season that we could talk about. And then in 2017, Georgia, Miami, and Stanford. If you look at last year, obviously undefeated, lost in a big game in the college football playoff. To me, a 30-point win at Duke, sure, you know, it gives you a little bit more confidence after Michigan, which was 2 weeks earlier, but it does not answer the big looming question, which is can Notre Dame elevate to the next level?
See, I'll disagree a little bit, and I understand your point about the big games, and that doesn't become any more evident from this Duke game, but I think the important thing is the confidence thing, and I think it gave him a lot more confidence, not just a little, because you watch Book's composure in this post-game press conference, and suddenly he's back to laughing, like he's that guy again, and even after Virginia Tech, he was the hero, but I mean, you could look at a lot of points in that game where he made some questionable calls. And so, yes, at the end, you know, that late score was important. But this was really the game that I think restored his confidence, which will be evident in the rest of the season.
And I'll add something too, Caroline. I don't know if Notre Dame really can answer those questions in my mind this season. Because
what
I don't
about
even
a New Year's
see,
Six Bowl? Could a New Year's Six Bowl do it?
Yeah, a New Year's Six could do it. It's going to be tough for Notre Dame to make that. We might talk about that later. But I think that Notre Dame really, looking at their opponents left, even a win against Navy, who's a ranked opponent, that's not going to feel like a big win. So for me, it's honestly going to start down the road with some of those big games like Wisconsin next year.
Navy's just always an outlier, too, because it's going to prove something very different, and it's more just that mind game as opposed to some of the other skills in different games. So a win this weekend would be awesome, but it's not going to tell you as much about the future as like some of these other opponents would.
I agree.
Well, some students around campus have just finished up their midterm exams. Ooh. They have an idea of where they stand in their classes. I hope we're doing well here, generally, yes?
I would say so.
Good, good.
Senior slide is definitely real. It's definitely real.
Okay. Is it worse than high school or not worse than high school?
No, it can't be as bad as high school.
It's close. It's close.
Okay, well, look, you know, you may not be the only senior who is running into some issues.
Yeah.
Ian Book, another one who has had a bit of an up and down season this year. We're going to talk about, we have professors here. Student term professor, David Korzanowski, our new professor, Caroline Pineda, a new professor. And it's time to give our midterm grades.
Let's do it.
Yes.
So let's start with Ian Book. Caroline, you're up first.
Yes.
Professor Pineda, we have a 2 professor setup here, and they're both grading the same students. You're first up. What does Book get?
Well, I give Book a B for Book, because I think, you know, it is the confidence game, and that's kind of my takeaway from Duke, is that he looked like Notre Dame's starting quarterback again. And so watching him in that game, I mean, he got his confidence back that I think will mean a lot more than, you know, just this game, so it'll translate to the rest of the season. Aside from that little trip that he had and the sack that he kind of just gave up, he was really efficient in the run game, and that's something that we haven't seen from him before. It's a new element, and I liked that. I still don't think he's going to be anywhere near these top quarterbacks in college football. I don't think he ever will. I don't think he has the mind for it, but it's important for him to get back to the point where he knows that he can make those big plays and be clutch for Notre Dame, and against a team like Navy, it's going to be more important than against Duke. So I give him a B.
Professor Pineda, I think, is a little bit too lenient. I give Ian Book right between a B- and a C+.
You can't do that. That's not.
That is. That's not his final grade.
Oh, final grade.
His final grade is he's got to be precise, but right now he can stick between.
That's not true.
Grades.
When I look at my midterm grades on
You're right. Okay.
It doesn't say between. Well, I hope it doesn't say between a B- and a C+, but it wouldn't say between anything.
You're right. Just for that, C+. Boom.
Wow.
Stick it.
Wow.
Ian Book can be confident against Duke, right? He can be confident against Duke. He was maybe the furthest thing from confident against Michigan. He was literally getting snaps and immediately running to one sideline or the other and throwing it out of bounds. His numbers in those games were not impressive. Georgia, he looked a little bit better, but 2 interceptions. Again, for me, Book has like the base level to be a solid quarterback. He can throw accurately. He can throw decently far down the field. He has a good completion percentage. His passing yard numbers aren't bad. Touchdown to interception ratio is right about par. But what makes an A-level quarterback, what makes an A-plus level quarterback, I think that's like the Jake Fromms and the Trevor Lawrences of the college football world. And I think Ian Book is at least 2 letter grades below that.
That's fair,
I would like to talk a little bit about his last game, though. His game against Duke, pretty good numbers, 18 for 32.
Yeah.
He had 181 yards, 4 touchdowns. Is that a step in the right direction now from Book? Is that going to sort of move him closer to that B range for you, David?
I think this week will show a lot, and I think a possible bowl game will show a lot. I just don't like his presence in big games, to put it simply. And I don't think it's just him. I think that's a larger problem with the team, like I talked about earlier, Caroline.
Yeah, and I think the big thing with Book, too, is that you didn't come into the season expecting him to be the
True.
Jake Fromm,
True.
the Trevor Lawrence. And so I think, that would have been an unfair expectation because he was never that type of quarterback. That's more the Phil Dracovic that we haven't seen yet. And so even in his glimpses, he hasn't shown that he can be Notre Dame's starting quarterback yet either. So I think when you look at Book's game, there's a lot of things going on. He hasn't had that solid of a run game aside from some good games from Tony Jones. So, he's had to do a lot more of that himself. And I think given the situation and given what he's had to deal with, minus that Michigan game, I think for the most part, he's had the composure. I think his problem is seeing the field. His biggest weakness to me as a quarterback is the fact that I don't think he reads well. And so if he can get past that, that's his biggest obstacle left. But that's something that you're going to expect from the Jake Fromms, you're not going to expect from the Ian Books.
Yeah.
Well, let's go into our second student. This is kind of a group of students that we're going to be
project,
grading here.
if you will.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's the defense. And
Yes.
we started with Caroline first last time. We're going to give it to Corzo this time.
Yeah.
Professor Korzanowski, what's your grade for the defense?
I have been very impressed with the defense this year. I give them an A.
Wow.
And I say that hesitantly because of that Michigan game where they gave up 45 points. First time over 30 points in over, I believe, 30 games for Notre Dame. And they've been great ever since. I mean, they only gave up 13 points against Virginia Tech because remember that fumble return, 7 points against Duke. And you got to remember, in that Michigan game, Michigan had only about 17 points until the middle of the third quarter. I thought the offense lost that game more than the defense did. I love the game planning from Clark Lee. I like every facet of this defense, the secondary, the linebacking core, and the defensive line. I think it's also going to be a big test. How good is the coaching down the stretch because they start to have some injuries, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, and to go off your point, in that Michigan game, that special teams error was really what put the defense in that bad spot. So I think minus that error on that punt, the defense wouldn't have been tired and might have had the chance to not allow a score on that drive. So that changes the momentum of the game drastically.
Yeah.
So I give the defense an A-. Still can't ignore that Michigan game. And I think there's been a couple other times this season where they haven't looked like as much of a unit. But what I really have been impressed with is how much the linebacking unit has come together. Drew White looks nothing like I thought he would look this
100%.
year. Asmar Bilal, same thing. So, I've been really impressed by them overall. They elevate that too, just as far as exceeding expectations go. And I think they will continue to do that throughout the rest of the season. And I think they will put up a good showing against Navy and the tough offense that they bring in.
We thank Professor Korzanowski. We thank Professor Pineda for
Thank
their input. Let's jump into Notre Dame's final 3 games of the season now. They've got Navy, you've got Boston College, they have Stanford. Navy, the lone ranked team left in the top 3. Let's talk about how tough of a road it is to the finish of the schedule. No bye weeks remaining, 3 consecutive games, and although Stanford might not be ranked, it's always a competitive matchup out there in California.
Yeah, now, okay, if I was not attending a school where we play a team that runs a triple option every single year, I would say without any hesitation that I'm a huge fan of the triple option offense, and I still am because it's fun to watch, it's dynamic, it's something new, and it's like the grit of these football players that's neat to watch, and it goes back to the roots of some of this older football. So, that being said, I think the Navy game is going to be the toughest one left. Stanford, yes, will be a tough matchup, especially on the road, but this is a Navy team that when they have good players to run a good offense, they are hard to beat.
Yep.
And they've put up some good showings this year. They're 7-1. Navy, to me, is the biggest question mark left on the schedule. BC isn't too much of a worry. Stanford on the road is, but not as much as Navy still.
I agree. I think that this last quarter of the season for Notre Dame is actually a lot more manageable than some of their past seasons. If you look at 2017, they had to play Miami and Stanford in the span of 3 weeks. If you look at this year, Navy never goes down easy, but I think it is a winnable game for this team. I think Notre Dame has a lot of talented athletes that can go up and really beat this Navy team. The tough thing about Navy is they never make mistakes, right? They rarely turn the ball over, consistently positive yardage. It's really tough to put them in 3rd and long situations because of the offense that they run. BC is an easy team to beat. Their defense is brutal, guys. I mean, they let up 500 yards of offense to Florida State last week. And Florida State's been struggling offensively all year.
Fired their coach, too, if that
Yep.
tells you how much they've been struggling.
Stanford's weird to me because they have a lot of bad losses. Like, they beat Northwestern at the beginning of the year, who is a one-win team. But they beat Washington. That's one that stands out to me because Washington's a really good team, perennially in the top of the Pac-12. Notre Dame also hasn't won a game at California in Palo Alto since 2007. Back to your point, Rooney. I do think that this is a more manageable Stanford team to beat, though, than past years. I think they're down, for sure.
I think the tough thing, though, is David Shaw, that Stanford coach, really seems like he can figure Brian Kelly out. And so I think the test is going to be now, okay, you bring in Clark Lee's defense, and there's been so much talk about it, and we've been impressed. How can they match up against a team that, David Shaw always seems like he figures Brian Kelly out. So I think that's going to be the big test, too. But he always has his team prepared. Even when we say, like, this isn't a great Stanford team, and it's not. But other years that we've said that, you wouldn't know it from the way that they come out against Notre Dame.
And let's talk about injuries. What kind of impact could the injuries have on the final 3 games of the schedule? A couple big players out for Notre Dame, Carolina.
I mean, Okora, first of all, yeah. I mean,
huge.
What else can you say except that is a devastating loss, So I think now it's going to be like, okay, so how can the rest of the defense come together now? And I touched on 2 of the ones that I've been most impressed by, just as far as bringing the defensive unit together as a whole, and that's Drew White and Esmar Bilal. So as far as stopping that run game, they have been impressive in that front. Obviously, that's huge against Navy because they do run the triple option, so that's kind of the big thing there for me. And, how can the linebacking core now, with maybe like less support, continue to really be like the strength in the offense? And I think they showed that they can be, so.
The big question for me is depth. How are these guys who were third string going to step up as getting consistent snaps at linebacker and defensive line? I'm looking at guys on the defense like Jordan Genmark-Heath, Shane Simon at the linebacking core. On the defensive line, guys like Jacob Lacey are going to start to play more and more, the Adamilola twins. Because right now that defensive line is Khalid Kareem, Jameer Jones. Well, I put Khalid Kareem in a class of his own. Jameer Jones and Ade Ogundeji are really going to have to step up. And the guys behind them. I mean, some of these younger players who might think, oh, I'll be playing next year, are going to have to step up and play big roles in these next few games. And I think it's just a test for Matt Balis and this team's physical capability and how much these guys can play down these last 3 games.
And Brian Kelly, to speak to the depth, too, might also have to dip into some of the guys that he was planning on redshirting.
Right.
Now, he could still redshirt those with the games left on the schedule because you can play in some games in a redshirt, but he's going to have to start playing guys that maybe he was planning to hold off on. So, like, the Adamilola twins both played last year and didn't redshirt, or one took a redshirt. So now you have that option where you're not going to have to worry about that with some guys, but some of the guys that he wants to look to for more depth, you're going to have the question now of, is it worth bringing them off of a redshirt season to give you that depth?
Kieran Cantwell had an opportunity to take a look at the upcoming week, or last week in college football, actually a couple of big-time games. Before we jump into that segment, though, I want to get one more take from you.
Yeah.
Does Notre Dame go 3-0 to finish the schedule?
That's tough. I think the most likely game that they would lose is this weekend, but I do think that they will win. They'll beat Navy, and I don't think they'll have trouble the last 2 games.
3-0. What do you say,
I think
Caroline?
they're fully capable of 3-0.
All right, well, let's send it down to Kieran Cantwell, who took a look at last week in college football.
Thanks, Austin. I'm Kieran Cantwell, and here's a recap of college football Week 11. The biggest early Saturday game took place in Minneapolis, with both Minnesota and Penn State entering their matchup without a loss. Despite the perfect similar records, Minnesota came in as a huge underdog, ranked at 17 compared to Penn State at number 4. Quarterback Tanner Morgan and the Gophers got off to a hot start, finishing the first half up 24-13, behind 3 touchdowns of 20-plus yards through the air. Receivers Rashad Bateman and Tyler Johnson combined for 307 of Morgan's 339 passing yards and 2 of his touchdown passes. Penn State almost fought back to take the lead with just a minute left, but quarterback Sean Clifford threw his 3rd interception of the day in the end zone as the Gophers hung on to beat the Nittany Lions 31-26. Minnesota will look to keep its improbable playoff hopes alive in the treacherous Big Ten next week at Iowa. In another game involving an undefeated team, number 12 Baylor traveled to Fort Worth to take on TCU. The first 4 quarters were a defensive battle, as regulation ended in a 9-9 tie from 3 field goals by each team. The offenses woke up in overtime, with both teams scoring touchdowns in the first and second overtime periods. Baylor kept the momentum going with a quick touchdown in the 3rd overtime, but TCU couldn't answer as quarterback Max Dugan threw a pick on 4th and goal. In a day where both offenses struggled mightily, Baylor receiver Denzel Mims had a standout day with 2 clutch touchdowns and 57 total yards. Baylor moved to 9-0 on the season, heading into their biggest game of the year in 2 weeks against Texas. With both teams ranked inside the top 3, LSU versus Alabama has been talked about as game of the year for the past 2 months, and it lived up to the hype. Heisman candidate and LSU quarterback Joe Burrow and the rest of the Tiger offense dominated the first half, leading to a 33-13 LSU lead heading into the break. Burrow would go on to finish the game with 457 total yards to go with those 3 touchdowns. Alabama almost completed the comeback as the Crimson Tide scored 4 touchdowns in the second half, but in the end, LSU proved to be too much for Nick Saban's team to handle. Alabama quarterback Tua Tagovailoa impressed in the loss, throwing for 418 yards and 4 touchdowns. LSU rose to the top of the rankings as a result of the win, while Alabama fell just outside the top 4, sitting at number 5. That's all for this week's recap in college football. Back to you guys in the studio.
We're going to get into a section called Buy or Sell in a moment. But before we go into that, let's talk a little bit about where the college football playoff poll sits today. LSU at number 1, Ohio State at number 2. I think that's sort of inevitable that LSU is going to make that jump after beating Alabama.
Yeah, I agree. I think the top 4 is about right now. I just think the SEC has a good chance to get 2 teams in. I think it could be either Georgia LSU or LSU Bama.
Yeah, I agree. I think it kind of makes sense where everything's sitting. LSU, Ohio State clearly atop right now, both looking dominant. Really, Joe Burrow and Ohio State atop right now.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Burrow's just been amazing to watch this season. I think has set himself apart as like the clear favorite for the Heisman. So at this point now you're getting toward the end of the season and really seeing stuff like that from him. So yeah, it makes sense that LSU is atop the nation right now.
One thing I'll add, I know Ohio State didn't have a big game this past weekend, but I'm still extremely high on them. I mean, I think the possibility of an LSU-Ohio State playoff matchup would be unbelievable to watch. I mean, Joe Burrow versus Justin Fields, a couple high-powered offenses. I think the score would be like 70-65. It'd be awesome.
One more team I want to talk about before we jump into Buy or Sell. Baylor, they were able to hang on. They are still undefeated. Do you like them at all?
No.
No.
Not really. My cousin just signed there to play baseball. Sorry, Jen.
Congrats.
Yeah, I know. It was cool. But he started talking trash about how they're defeated and Notre Dame isn't. And I was like, okay, let's put you up against Georgia and Michigan and see how you fare. Like, I mean, no. I don't think there's much to it.
I think that they have played a lot of close games. I think Matt Rule has done a great job. I look at him and PJ Fleck as a couple of the best coaches who are up and coming in the
PJ
Power
Fleck.
5 right now. I know.
I am on to the PJ Fleck.
We got a
parade.
Flecker. We got a Flecker to my right. But no, I agree. I think that Baylor will lose this weekend. I think they'll lose pretty handily, and I think there's a possibility they could lose 1 or 2 more games.
Well, now let's get into that section of Buy or Sell. The first team up on our list is the Georgia Bulldogs, ranked 4th right now in the country. They're an interesting story. Of course, beat the Fighting Irish earlier in the season, but suffered a really bad loss to South Carolina. Now, I saw a lot of people who were saying Alabama should be ahead of Georgia. They lost to the number 1 team in the country. Georgia lost to a unranked team. Do you buy that argument, Caroline?
I would sell on Georgia. I don't
sell on
think,
Georgia?
yes, because I think, you're going to want to buy on them, you're going to want them to win the conference championship. I don't think they're going to win the conference championship because you're going to go up against an LSU team that we just talked about is just an amazing offense, and I don't think Georgia really stands a chance. If you look at the Notre Dame game when they, played us in Athens, Georgia, to me, did not look as strong as I expected. Notre Dame kept themselves in that game, and power to Notre Dame for doing that. But to me, Georgia came out not looking like the Georgia team that I expected to see after the hype of that matchup. Now, the second half, they made those adjustments, and that is what differentiates those good teams from those great teams, is making those in-game adjustments, which they're capable of doing. I like Jake Fromm, but I really just don't think they're going to be a team down the stretch that is able to hang with the LSUs, the Ohio States. I don't think you buy on that.
I agree. I'm selling as well. I look at them as kind of an old school SEC team. And when I say that, what do I mean? I mean that their offense isn't super high powered. It's a traditional offense. They're scoring between 20 and 30 points a game, long, consistent drives, not a ton of big chunk plays. I look at their loss to LSU, 23-20. They played them close, controlled the game against Florida 24-17. But I think that you start to play more and more of these high-powered offenses, and the defense is on the field quite a bit, getting gassed. I just don't think that Georgia can keep up. I think that they will be in the conference championship. I think they will lose to LSU. But also, you got to look at this Auburn game this weekend. Georgia could lose at Auburn. I mean, Bo Nix and that offense, that is, I think, a matchup that probably favors Auburn on paper. I think it's going to be a shootout between Fromm and Bo Nix, and I think that Georgia's going to have to win in shootout type games to win it all, and I don't think that they can do that. So I'm selling.
Next team up on our list is the 6th-ranked team in the country, according to the College Football Playoff poll. That would be the Oregon Ducks. Do you buy the Oregon Ducks, David Korzenowski?
I buy, and I still think they might miss the playoff, if that makes sense. I think that Oregon right now will win the rest of their games. Their schedule isn't too hard with Arizona, Arizona State, and Oregon State. That Pac-12 championship will also be fun against Utah. But I think it all is going to depend on the SEC, because I think if it comes down to, say, a 12-1 LSU or an 11-1 Bama versus a 12-1 conference championship Oregon, whose loss was to an SEC team, I think that that's going to be a very interesting conversation and a contentious one. With that being said, I like the Ducks a lot. I think they have a great offense. Look at Justin Herbert's numbers, 2,300 passing yards, 24 touchdowns, 2 interceptions all year. I mean, this offense is great. Big comeback win against Washington, and they control the game against USC. I like what I'm seeing from that team.
I would agree with you. My first point, too, is that weakness of the schedule remaining. There really isn't anyone that I would expect to put up much of a fight against Oregon. Again, don't think the conference championship would be too much of a hurdle against Utah. So I like the Oregon team, and I think, this is another, the whole storyline has been, Texas is back. But Oregon also, is a high-powered offense and is now kind of bringing that storyline back and getting to the point where they could be in the playoff conversation. Now, I agree. I think the College Football Playoff Committee is always going to slight the Pac-12 over the SEC. I just think, if there's an argument to be made for an SEC team over a Pac-12 team, I think it's going to rule in favor of the SEC. So I, too, don't think that Oregon really has that great of a chance to make the playoff unless some other things go right for them. And it's not really a control-your-own-destiny kind of situation. That being said, I don't think that stops you from buying on this team.
One more quick team to take a look at, the Minnesota Gophers, Golden Gophers, actually. They are undefeated, ranked 8th in the country. Let's take a quick pick, buy or sell on Minnesota, David.
Okay. Well,
can Caroline, I'm sorry.
So
you got to start with the biggest.
Caroline, go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm so on the PJ Fleck train. I think he has turned this program from something that people didn't go watch. They had one of the worst attendance rating. No one wanted to show up to these games. It's cold pretty early. No one in Minnesota was interested in going to watch this team play. He comes, he turns this program around. Mid-season, they sign him to a contract extension because they know that this is a coach who's going to do big things for their program. He fits every requirement of a coach that you would want to see at a program like this. And, hey, another coach who ended up doing pretty well at Notre Dame came from Minnesota. Lou
David,
Holtz.
any thoughts?
Just saying. Wait, hold on.
Buy?
Wait, no.
Are you buying?
Yes. Oh, my gosh, I'm buying. Okay, wait,
That
sorry.
means
I forgot my
Are
argument.
they making the tournament?
No,
the playoff?
they're not making the playoff.
Okay,
No,
but
not
you're
this
still
year. But
buying
you're still buying. Same thing with Oregon. No, I don't think they'll make it to the playoff. Not this year, but you're building this long-term program. You're setting them up for success. He's changing the energy. He's one of those coaches that walks into the locker room and energizes his players, and that's not the kind of coach that you see at some of these other programs. Right,
David,
so
go ahead.
I'm saying you buy on them because I think long-term this will pay off.
Yeah, I'm not sold yet. I mean, you're in the left lane of the highway going 100 miles an hour right now. I think that this is a good team. I think they're establishing a good culture. I'm still selling right now. I think that you're buying a little bit too early. They've won one big game. You also got to keep in mind. Hear me. I know you're not saying that. They almost lost to Penn State. They played a borderline perfect game and still almost lost. Penn State had a chance to go down and score the game-winning touchdown. I still think they're recruits away from being a contender for the Big Ten championship, and their schedule this year is the reason that they're not in it.
Well, so here's my rebuttal to the Penn State thing, though. Penn State is recruiting at a very high level because Penn State is one of those programs that can do that. Minnesota's not. So if they put themselves now in the conversation to possibly, have people say that they should make the playoff or should at least be close to it, you suddenly now are going to get recruits who are going to be those high-caliber players. So if you can beat Penn State without that recruiting, I'm not saying that one big win is going to mean that you want to, buy on this team forever, but I'm saying that this is a program now that is going to be set up for success because when you start winning games, you start recruiting better, you put your name out there, and suddenly that's what Fleck has done, and now Minnesota is a program that people are talking about in college football, which just hadn't been the case for so many years.
Well, we're going to jump into Notre Dame now. Let's take a look at Paul Farrington, who had a chance to check out the keys for this weekend's game against Navy.
Thanks, Austin. I'm Paul Farrington with your 3 keys to the game. Key number 1, get points on the board early. In running the triple option, Navy's goal is to shorten the game. The fewer possessions Notre Dame's offense has, the happier Ken Niumatalolo and the midshipmen will be. By jumping out to an early lead, Notre Dame can flip Navy's strategy to work against them. On the season, Navy has run the ball 471 times compared to only 62 passing attempts. A ground and pound offense is not structured to play from behind. so forcing Navy to play catch-up through the passing game would put both the midshipmen in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory. Key number 2, win the battle at the line of scrimmage. Defensively, Navy boasts one of the most statistically impressive run defenses in the country. To this point in the season, the midshipmen have not allowed a 200-yard rushing performance against anyone on their schedule, something that happened 6 times last year. A key advantage the Notre Dame offensive line has in this battle is its size and strength compared to the undersized Navy defensive line. Navy has only 3 starting defensive linemen weighing over 240 pounds, with just one of them being over 260 pounds. The Irish offensive line is a different story. The average weight of the Notre Dame offensive line is 306 pounds. Although the Irish have struggled running the ball for much of this season, Tony Jones Jr. and Jafar Armstrong both have the chance for a big game behind their offensive line. On the offensive side of the ball, the midshipmen love to run between the tackles. On the season, Navy's fullbacks have combined for 860 rushing yards and 15 total touchdowns. A successful inside rushing attack could force the Notre Dame defense to overcommit and become susceptible to large gains along the perimeter. Success from the Notre Dame defensive line will certainly help to ease pressure on the Irish linebackers. Key number 3. Navy has converted just under 48.5% of their third down attempts this season, ranking 13th in the nation. For Notre Dame, getting off the field will be critical as the midshipmen can wear defenses out with their long, grueling possessions. Navy's best chance on Saturday is to keep the ball out of Ian Book's hands, and their third down efficiency will play a large role in achieving their game plans.
Thanks so much, Paul. Great analysis there on our 3 keys to the game. Let's talk a little bit about that triple option. Does it give Notre Dame some troubles, David?
Yes, absolutely. It's a nightmare to prepare for the triple option. I know the defense dreads it. It's all of a sudden you have to learn a whole new style of playing, stopping the offenses. Because really, I mean, people forget with the triple option, you only need 2.5 yards of play, right? And that because they'll go on it, they'll go for fourth down a handful of times. The D tackles really have to step up, clog those running lanes.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be an interesting game to watch from the standpoint of not coming off a bye week, when usually Notre Dame will plan their schedule around having a bye week before Navy, giving yourself 2 weeks to prepare for the team that is like no other on your schedule. This year that wasn't the case, so not having a bye week coming into Navy might mean it takes a little bit longer to get in the swing of things for the defense, so I'll be interested to see how fast they can adjust to Navy's unique style of play.
Notre Dame did not have a bye week last week, did not have a particularly tough matchup against Duke with that said, but let's jump into fact or fiction now. Let's see, starting with the number of passing attempts for Navy. Navy notoriously runs the ball much more than they pass, as Paul alluded to. Over under, actually, is it fact or fiction, is more than 6.5 passing attempts for Navy. David.
I'm saying fact, because Navy is going to have to throw the ball a little bit more to kind of keep Notre Dame on their toes. If you look, they average 7.75 passing attempts per game. They only threw 7 passes against a good Tulane team and scored 41 points. I mean, it seems almost like impossible to do this, but I think that they're going to need a couple slant passes over the middle to beat this Notre Dame defense and keep them on their toes.
I agree from the same logic. I think this is a game where Notre Dame has to shake something up, and so does Navy. You're going up against the best team on your schedule. This is going to now give you the chance to try something new. And Malcolm Perry has shown that when he does use the ball in the air, he can be efficient. So his passing game is not as bad as like some of the Navy quarterbacks we've seen in the past. So when you have a quarterback who does have a decent arm, you have a guy who now can introduce some of those new elements for you. I think he'll be over 6.5.
Next one up, the defensive backs historically in cold games have warmed up shirtless. Caroline, this was your one you picked.
Yeah,
Do you
so
say it happens
as we
or
were in
not?
our meeting, we were talking about this, and they did it against Florida State, and I was like, oh, I wonder if they'll come out shirtless as like the we're so tough thing. And I don't remember if it was Chris or Paul, but someone in there was like, how can you outgrit Navy? It's the Naval Academy. I think those guys would come out and be like, that's really cute.
Yeah,
we go to the Naval Academy. So I do think they will. I think they kind of going out with that assertive quality of this doesn't bother us, we don't care about the cold. They did it against USC, which wasn't that cold, but it was a night game and it was pretty chilly. So yeah, I would expect they do warm up shirtless as a rally
David,
moment.
fact or fiction?
I'm saying fiction. They're going to warm up in military uniforms.
All right, I like it. Last one up here, the student section, 70+% full at the end of the game. David, fact or fiction?
Fiction. Sellout streak is ending. I know
what percentage do you have?
my friends are soft. They will be out of that game in the second quarter.
What's the percentage we have?
60.
Okay. Caroline,
Which
what's your
would be
percentage?
more than Michigan had at halftime in their student section when we were at Michigan, which granted was a terrible game.
Because they were already hitting the bars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
finish up here, our predictions for today's game. Caroline, we're starting with you. What's Notre Dame Navy final score?
Yeah,
here?
I would say 31-10. I think the Notre Dame defense does take a bit
Wow.
to settle in. I would expect that Navy does get a score in the first half.
Whoa. Sorry. No, I'm just no. It's.
I feel insulted. What is wrong
I
with my prediction?
think it's going to be tough to hold Navy to 10 points. I mean, this is an offense that scores a lot. I think
Yeah.
30 to 24.
If you look at their team last year, though, they did struggle to score.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's tough with the triple option.
That'll do it for us with Shamrock Sports. Tune in next week.